Absaroka Range, Montana Territory, October 1887. The air was already a liar. It carried the scent of pine sap and sun-warmed granite, a sweet deception that promised a long and gentle autumn. But Alara Vance knew better. She felt the truth in the ache of her bones, a dull thrum that echoed the memory of her late husband's warnings. Liam had understood this land's capacity for treachery. He had seen the beauty as a mask, a beautiful face hiding cruel intentions. She stood at the edge of her small clearing, a widow with 2 small children and a cabin that felt more like a trap than a shelter. The settlement of Prospect's Hope was a mile down the winding track, a small collection of cabins huddled together for warmth and company. A warmth and company Alara no longer felt. Since Liam's death in the spring, crushed by a falling lodgepole pine, the town's pity had become a weight. It was a blanket that smothered will, a soft, suffocating kindness that expected her to fail. They saw her as a problem waiting for winter. A woman alone, with a son, Caleb, who was only 7, and a daughter, Rose, barely 5. Her woodpile, stacked neatly against the north wall of the cabin, was a monument to her summer's labor, but it was a pittance against the coming cold. It looked substantial now in the golden light of October, but she knew it was a finite resource, a dwindling currency against a debt that would soon come due. The cold intended to kill, and it was a patient creditor. What about you? What future are you staring at, knowing that the conventional wisdom and the resources you have are simply not enough to meet the coming storm? What secret knowledge do you hold, dismissed by others, that might be your only true salvation? Alara's cabin was a standard build, identical to nearly every other in Prospect's Hope. It was the work of Silas Thorne, the town's founder, lumberman, and unquestioned authority on all things related to shelter. He built with thick, hand-hewn logs, chinked with mud and moss, solid and square against the wind. And at the heart of every cabin, he installed the same black heart, a pot-bellied, cast-iron stove, the latest and greatest model, hauled by wagon all the way from Bozeman. It was a hungry god that demanded a constant sacrifice of split pine and fir. She hated the stove. It was a tyrant. When fed, it raged with a dry, blistering heat that made the air shimmer and drove them to the far corners of the single room. The metal would tick and ping, a sound like a nervous insect, and the stovepipe would glow a faint, menacing cherry red where it passed through the ceiling. But its generosity was fleeting. An hour after the last log was consumed, the heat would vanish, sucked out through the 1,000 tiny gaps in the walls and the loose-fitting window frames. The cold would then return with a vengeance, a physical presence that crept across the floorboards and laid its icy hands on sleeping children. The cabin would become colder than the air outside, a box of captured frost. Liam had hated it too. He was a man of the sea, born and raised in a coastal town in Maine where the cold was a damp, clinging thing, not this dry, predatory monster. He had been a shipwright, a builder of hulls meant to withstand the crushing, constant pressure of the Atlantic. He saw the world through a different lens. He understood forces that the mountain men, for all their rugged competence, ignored. "They fight the cold, Alara," he had told her one night, his voice a low rumble as he stared at the glowing stove. They try to shout it down. You can't shout down the ocean, and you can't shout down a Montana winter. You have to be smarter than it. You have to steal its strength. He had tapped his temple. It's all just pressure. Heat, cold, water, wind. Just different kinds of pressure. The trick is to make them work for you, not against you. After his death, in the hollowed-out months of early summer, Alara found his journal. It was a simple, leather-bound book, filled with his precise, angular script and detailed drawings of hull cross-sections, keel designs, and rigging knots. But tucked in the back, on pages stained with what looked like coffee and engine grease, were his thoughts on the mountains. They were the notes of a brilliant outsider, a man applying the logic of the shipyard to the wilderness. One entry, dated the previous winter, seized her. It was accompanied by a strange, looping diagram. "The river does not freeze to its bed," he wrote. "Even under 2 feet of ice, the water flows. The earth below the frost line is the same, a constant temperature, a reservoir of not cold. The ground is a hull. The cabin is a ship on a frozen sea. The problem is not the cold outside, but the lack of warmth within. We bring in frozen wood to make a brief, violent fire. We invite the enemy in and then try to kill him. Foolish. We should be drawing on the one constant friend we have, the deep earth." Below this, a sketch showed her cabin, and from beneath the stone hearth, a long, narrow tunnel snaked through the earth, ending at the steep, gravelly bank of the Swiftwater River 50 feet away. Arrows indicated airflow. Words were scribbled in the margins. Thermal siphon. Geothermal intake. Let the hearth breathe the river's warmth. It was madness. It was the beautiful, impractical dreaming of a man who saw the world in ways no one else did. It was the idea that had likely gotten him mocked in the logging camps. And it was the only thing that felt like hope. The community saw her grief as a fragile state. They brought her venison and jars of preserved beans. Silas Thorne himself came by, his face a mask of gruff sympathy, and offered to have his sons cut and stack a winter's worth of wood for her, for a small portion of Liam's timber claim, of course. It was a fair offer, by the town's logic. It was also an admission of her helplessness. She refused, politely but firmly. The refusal shifted the town's pity into a quiet, simmering judgment. A foolish woman. Proud. A liability in the making. She was choosing her own doom, and they would all be forced to witness it, and eventually clean up the mess. That week, with a pickaxe that was too heavy for her and a shovel Liam had fashioned from a saw blade and an ash bough, Alara began to dig. She started in the crawl space beneath the cabin, a dark, spider-haunted space that smelled of damp earth and mouse droppings. She pried up the flagstones of the hearth's foundation, revealing the dark, compacted soil beneath. The work was brutal. The ground was laced with stone and thick, stubborn roots. Every swing of the pickaxe sent a jarring shock up her arms and into her shoulders. Her hands, soft from a summer of mourning, were quickly blistered, then torn raw. She dug with a cold, silent fury. Each rock she hauled out was a piece of the town's pity. Each shovelful of dirt was a measure of their doubt. She was not just digging a tunnel. She was excavating a new reality for herself and her children, a future that did not depend on the charity of men like Silas Thorne. The children watched her, their faces smudged with dirt, their eyes wide with a mixture of confusion and loyalty. Caleb, trying to be the man of the house, would haul small rocks away in his father's old canvas bucket. Rose would sit by the lantern, singing softly to her cornhusk doll, a small beacon of innocence in the encroaching darkness. The tunnel was a maw, a hungry mouth swallowing her time and her strength. It was narrow, just wide enough for her to crawl through on her hands and knees. She lined it as she went with flat stones hauled up from the riverbed, fitting them together with the patient, interlocking precision her husband had used in his boat models. This was not just a hole in the ground. It had to be a conduit, a vessel. It had to be strong, a permanent feature of the earth itself. Liam's notes were specific. The stone is the battery. It must hold the earth's temper. Day after day, she disappeared into the earth. She would emerge at dusk, covered in a second skin of mud and sweat, her muscles screaming in protest. She grew leaner, harder. The soft lines of grief were etched away, replaced by a sinewy resolve. The townspeople saw her, of course. They saw the growing pile of displaced earth behind her cabin. They saw her hauling stones from the river, her back bent, her face set like flint. Whispers followed her when she went to the mercantile for flour and salt. The widow Vance has lost her mind. Grief's done broke her. Digging a root cellar, is she? A cellar to nowhere. The pity was gone now, replaced by a cocktail of morbid curiosity and outright mockery. She was the town's cautionary tale, a living ghost story for their children. She was the woman who was digging her own grave. It took her 6 weeks. 6 weeks of backbreaking, solitary labor. The tunnel stretched 50 feet, a slight downward grade from the cabin to the riverbank. The final section was the most dangerous, cutting through the loose scree and gravel of the bank itself. She shored it up with the biggest, heaviest stones she could manage, her body trembling with effort. When she finally broke through, the opening was a small, dark hole, hidden beneath the tangled roots of an old cottonwood, about 4 feet above the autumn water level. A puff of cool, damp air, smelling of wet stone and moving water, sighed into the tunnel, the first breath of her creation. She crawled back to the hearth, exhausted, but electric with a feeling she hadn't had since Liam was alive. The profound satisfaction of having built something true. She sealed the tunnel to the hearth's foundation with a thick mortar of clay and sand, leaving a small, stone-lined opening at the base of the firebox, which she could cover with a fitted stone plug. Her work was done. Her folly was complete. It was Silas Thorne who finally confronted her. He had watched her progress with a tightening knot of irritation in his gut. This was his valley. These were his cabins, his methods. Her strange, silent project was an affront to his authority, an act of architectural heresy. He found her by the river, washing the clay from her hands and face. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows, and the air had a new, sharper edge to it. Winter was no longer a distant threat. It was just over the next ridge. "Ilara," he said. His voice was not unkind, but it was heavy with the certainty of his own rightness. "I have to ask what you think you're doing. The whole town is talking. They're worried. I'm worried." "I'm preparing for winter, Silas," she said, not looking at him. Her voice was quiet, raspy from the dust of the tunnel. "Preparing?" He gestured with a sweep of his thick arm towards the pile of dirt and her small woodpile. "By digging a hole? Woman, your woodpile wouldn't last a proper January. You have 2 children in that cabin. This is not a game. This is survival." "I know what it is," she replied, finally meeting his gaze. Her eyes were clear, devoid of the madness he had expected to find. They were simply tired and very, very determined. He had followed her back to the cabin then, his boots crunching on the frosted grass. He insisted on seeing her work. She let him inside. The cabin was clean, sparse. A small fire was dying in the hearth, not the stove. He noticed immediately that the big pot-bellied stove was cold, pushed into a corner, and covered with a dusty canvas sheet. He knelt by the hearth, his knees cracking. He saw the small, dark opening at its base. "What is this?" he demanded. "It's an intake," she said simply. "An intake for what? For cold air? For river damp? For snakes? My God, Alara, are you trying to invite the cold directly into your house?" He laughed, a short, barking sound of disbelief. "You've built a chimney in reverse. All the heat you make will pour right out of it. Or worse, the winter air will pour right in. You'll freeze solid before the first real snow." "The earth isn't frozen down that deep, Silas," she said, her voice patient, as if explaining something to a child. "Neither is the river. It's a constant temperature. It's warmer than the air will be." Silas stared at her, his face a thundercloud of frustration and pity. "That's not how heat works," he said, his voice rising. "Heat rises. You build a fire, the heat goes up the chimney. You open a hole at the bottom, the cold comes in. It's the simplest physics. It's the rule of things. You've spent weeks of labor building a device that will actively refrigerate your own home. It is the single most dangerous piece of foolishness I have ever seen." He stood up, dusting off his knees. His judgment was delivered. "This is madness, Alara. Pure, grief-addled madness. You cover that hole. You cover it with stone and mud, and you forget this fantasy. You get that stove fired up, and you let my boys bring you some real wood before you kill yourself and those children." She said nothing. She just stood by her hearth, her hand resting on the cool stones. His verdict echoed through Prospect's hope, carried on the winds of gossip and righteous concern. The widow Vance was not just a fool, she was a danger. Her project was no longer a curiosity, it was a scandal. She had rejected sound advice, the proven wisdom of the man who built their very homes. Her isolation was now complete. She was an island, and the entire community waited for the sea of winter to reclaim her. The narrator must now pause this story, because to understand what happened next, you must understand the profound difference between the weapons Silas Thorne had given his people and the shelter Alara Vance had built for her family. You have to understand the two opposing philosophies of survival at play. The conventional wisdom of Prospect's hope, embodied by Silas and his cast iron stove, was based on a principle of violent opposition. The stove was a weapon designed to wage a temporary, localized war against the cold. When you fed it wood, you were feeding ammunition into a cannon. The resulting explosion of heat was powerful, but it was also chaotic and profoundly inefficient. The science is called convective heating. The stove superheats the air directly around it. This hot air, being less dense, immediately and rapidly rises to the ceiling. This creates a powerful upward draft, a phenomenon known as the stack effect. In a perfectly sealed modern home, this might be manageable. But in a log cabin from 1887, a structure riddled with countless tiny invisible gaps, between the logs, around the window frames, through the roof sheathing, the stack effect becomes a relentless pump. It actively sucks cold, dense outside air into the cabin through every crack and crevice near the floor to replace the hot air escaping through the roof. This is why, in such a cabin, your head could be sweating while your feet were freezing. The stove was fighting a battle on two fronts, against the cold outside and against the vacuum it was creating inside. It had to burn ferociously just to maintain a bubble of warmth in the center of the room, while actively drawing its enemy through the gates. It was a strategy of brute force, and it consumed fuel at a terrifying rate. When the fuel ran out, the battle was instantly lost. The cold didn't just seep back in, it flooded the vacuum, leaving the cabin colder and damper than before. The stove was a shout. Alara's creation, the river hearth, was based on a completely different principle, one understood by ancient Roman engineers and master shipbuilders alike. It was a philosophy of cooperation with natural forces, not opposition to them. Her system was not a weapon, it was a bank, a battery, and a lung. The key was thermal mass and geothermal stability. The deep earth, below the frost line, maintains a remarkably constant temperature year-round. In her region, this was approximately 45 degrees Fahrenheit. The flowing water at the bottom of the river, protected by a layer of insulating ice, was similar, perhaps a bit colder, but still well above freezing. This was her reservoir of baseline warmth, a permanent, inexhaustible supply. Her long, stone-lined tunnel was not just a conduit for air, it was a heat exchanger. As outside air was drawn into the hidden opening on the riverbank, it began its 50-foot journey through the earth. Over that distance, traveling through a tunnel built of stone, the air had no choice but to surrender its killing cold to the surrounding thermal mass of the earth. By the time it reached the hearth, the air had been naturally pre-warmed from, say, -20 degrees to a much more manageable 40 or 45 degrees. It was no longer an enemy. It was a neutral party. The small fire in her hearth was not a weapon. Its job was not to fight the cold, but simply to act as the gentle engine of the system. The heat from the small fire created just enough of a draft up the chimney to create a slight negative pressure within the cabin. This pressure was the pump that slowly, steadily, and constantly drew the pre-warmed, tempered air from the tunnel. This created a gentle, continuous circulation of fresh, moderately warm air. But the true genius was the thermal battery. The massive stone hearth and the stone floor around it absorbed the gentle heat from the fire and the incoming air, not violently, but slowly, deeply. They became a radiator of gentle, radiant heat. Radiant heat doesn't warm the air, it warms objects, the people, the furniture, the walls themselves. It was the difference between standing in the wind on a sunny day versus a cloudy one. The air temperature might be the same, but the sun's radiant energy makes all the difference. Her system was making the smoke pay rent. It was not shouting at the winter, it was telling it a long, warm story. It was a quiet, constant, and incredibly efficient system that relied on balance, not force. The first snows came in November, a gentle dusting that glamorized the sharp edges of the landscape. The people of Prospect's Hope settled into their winter rhythms. The sound of axes splitting wood became the town's heartbeat. Smoke plumed from every chimney, thick and gray against a steel-colored sky. Alara lit a small fire in her hearth. She kept it burning day and night, a tiny flame, no bigger than a man's fist, fed with small branches and twigs she could gather easily. She removed the stone plug from the tunnel intake. A slow, almost imperceptible current of cool, clean air flowed into the room. It didn't feel like a draft. It was just a presence. The stone floor around the hearth, once a block of ice, became merely cool to the touch. The cabin was not hot. It never was. But it ceased to be cold. A stable, quiet equilibrium settled over the small space. The brutal swings in temperature were gone. The air was fresh, without the suffocating, scorched quality produced by the iron stove. The children slept in their own beds, under quilts, and did not wake up crying from the cold. In early December, the first real cold snap arrived. The temperature dropped to 10 below zero and stayed there for a week. The town's stoves began their hungry roar. The axes fell faster. Men began to eye their woodpiles with a new anxiety. In the mercantile, Ilara heard the talk. She bought her supplies, her face calm, and listened as men complained about how much wood they were burning, how the cold was relentless this year. Silas Thorne saw her. "Getting cold in that cabin of yours, Ilara?" he asked, his voice loud enough for the whole store to hear. "Got that hole plugged up tight?" "We're comfortable, thank you, Silas," she replied, and his mockery fell flat against her simple sincerity. It was an answer he could not comprehend. The second week of December, the sky turned a strange, luminous gray. The wind died completely. A profound, unnatural stillness fell over the valley. The old-timers, the trappers who knew the signs, looked to the ridges and felt a deep unease. This was not the feel of a storm. This was the feel of an invasion. It was the Great Freeze of '88, an event that would be spoken of in hushed tones for generations. A mass of Arctic air, a polar vortex as future generations would call it, had broken free from its home and was sweeping down across the continent. It began at dusk. The temperature, which had been hovering near zero, fell as if dropped off a cliff. Within an hour, it was 20 below. By midnight, it was 35 below zero, with a wind that was just beginning to stir, a razor-edged breeze that found every crack. The world outside became an alien planet, hostile to all forms of life. The very air was a weapon. Inside Silas Thorne's cabin, the largest and best built in the settlement, the war had begun. The pot-bellied stove was roaring, consuming split oak logs, his best, driest fuel, with insatiable hunger. The metal sides glowed a dull, angry red in the dim light. Silas, his wife Mary, and their 3 children were huddled near it, wrapped in every blanket they owned. Yet only 6 feet away from the stove, the air was a torment. A thick layer of frost, intricate as lace, was blooming on the interior walls. The nails in the timbers had turned into conduits of pure cold, each one rimmed with a halo of white ice. The water in the bucket by the door was a solid block. "More wood, Pa," his eldest son stammered, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. The sound was swallowed by the shriek of the wind, which was now a physical force, pressing against the cabin, trying to find a way in. The log walls groaned under the pressure. A fine, glittering dust of snow was being driven through the chinking, settling in pale lines on the floor. Silas looked at his woodpile, the one he had bragged about all autumn. It was shrinking with terrifying speed. The stove was not warming the cabin. It was merely keeping a small circle of air from freezing them all to death. Fear, cold and sharp, began to coil in his gut. His expertise, his rules, his entire understanding of the world was failing. The cold was shouting louder than his fire, and it was winning. 50 feet from the howling river, in a cabin Silas had condemned as a death trap, it was quiet. The wind screamed outside, a distant, frustrated beast, but inside Ilara's home, the air was still. The small, placid fire in the hearth crackled and hissed, a sound of profound domesticity. It cast a gentle, flickering light on the room. Rose and Caleb were asleep in their beds, their breathing deep and even. They were not huddled by the fire. They were simply sleeping, warm and safe. Alara sat in her rocking chair, mending a tear in Caleb's trousers. She wore a simple wool shawl over her dress. She was not sweating, nor was she shivering. The air in the cabin was a constant, comfortable 60 degrees. It was not the oppressive heat of the stove, but a pervasive, gentle warmth that seemed to emanate from the very bones of the house. She placed her bare hand on the stone floor a few feet from the hearth. It was not hot. It was not cold. It was the temperature of life itself. She could feel the faintest vibration, the slow, steady pulse of the earth breathing into her home. She looked at her woodpile, the one Silas had mocked. She had barely touched it. Her small fire required so little. It was a pilot light for a vast, gentle engine. She was not fighting the winter. She had made a treaty with it, brokered by the earth itself. She was safe. Her children were safe. Liam had been right. For 2 days and 2 nights, the freeze held the valley in its grip. The temperature dropped to 48 below zero. The mercury in the town's official thermometer froze. Trees, their sap frozen solid, exploded with a sound like rifle shots. In Prospect's Hope, it was a slow-motion catastrophe. Families burned through their winter wood in a desperate losing battle. They burned furniture. They burned fence posts. One by one, their fires died. The cabins became tombs of ice. The cold was no longer a threat. It was a conqueror. In Silas Thorne's cabin, the end came on the morning of the 3rd day. The last of the oak was gone. The fire dwindled to a handful of glowing embers. The monstrous cold, which had been held at bay just beyond the circle of the stove, flooded the room. The frost on the walls thickened, grew fur. The air became painful to breathe, each inhalation a spike of ice in the lungs. Mary was weeping, her face pale, her lips blue. His youngest child was listless, his eyes glassy. Panic, stark and absolute, seized Silas. He had been so sure, so certain in his knowledge. His pride had built these cabins. His pride had heated them. And now his pride was going to be the death of his family. But then, through the fog of his fear, a memory surfaced. An image of Alara Vance's calm, determined face. The memory of her quiet words. "We're comfortable, thank you, Silas." It was impossible. A delusion. She had to be dead, frozen solid in her monument to foolishness. And yet, what if she wasn't? The question was a tiny spark in the frozen landscape of his despair. It was a sliver of impossible hope. He had to know. If he was going to die, he had to know why he had been so wrong. He moved with the desperation of a drowning man. He bundled his wife and children in every remaining scrap of wool and hide. "We're going out," he croaked, his voice a stranger in his own throat. The journey was a nightmare. The 50 yards to his nearest neighbor's cabin was a polar expedition. The wind cut through their clothes, stealing breath and will. He found them huddled together, their fire dead for hours, barely alive. He gathered them, and then the next family. A small, desperate caravan of ghosts stumbling through a world of white. He was leading them to the widow Vance's cabin, to the place he had publicly condemned. He was leading them there for answers, or perhaps just to die in a new location. He expected to find the cabin dark, its chimney cold, its inhabitants lost. He was prepared to break down the door and find their frozen bodies, a final, tragic confirmation of his own wisdom. He reached the clearing. The cabin stood silent, almost buried in drifting snow. There was no plume of thick, desperate smoke pouring from the chimney, only a thin, pale wisp that was almost invisible against the gray sky. His heart sank. He had been a fool. He had led these people on a death march. He hammered on the door with a numb fist, the sound flat and dead in the oppressive cold. He waited for the silence to answer him. Instead, he heard the scrape of a wooden bar being lifted from inside. The door swung open, and a wave of warmth washed over him. It was not a blast of heat. It was a gentle, impossible wave of calm, temperate air. It smelled of baking bread and wood smoke and clean linen. It was the smell of a normal life, a smell that had no right to exist in this frozen hell. Ilara Vance stood there, a lantern in her hand. Her face showed no surprise, no fear, only a deep, weary compassion. Behind her, her children sat at a small table, eating bowls of hot oatmeal. The cabin was bathed in a soft, golden light. It was an arc of warmth in a world of ice. Silas stumbled forward, his followers pressing in behind him, their faces masks of disbelief. He looked around the room. There was no frost on the walls. The single window was clear, looking out on the white fury of the storm. He reached out a trembling hand and laid it on the stone floor near the hearth. It was warm. A deep, steady, life-giving warmth that seemed to rise from the center of the earth. He looked from the placid, tiny fire in the hearth to the serene faces of her children, to the impossible, life-affirming warmth of the room. His entire world, his lifetime of certainty, of rules and proven methods, shattered into a million pieces. All his knowledge was a lie. All his pride was ash. He was the fool. He was the one whose madness had almost killed his family. He turned back to Ilara, his eyes rimmed with ice, now filling with hot, shameful tears. He opened his mouth, but the grand speeches, the apologies, the explanations, they all died in his throat. Only one word could escape the wreckage of his certainty. "How?" he whispered. The sound was broken, the question of a man who had lost his religion. Ilara looked at him, and in her eyes there was no triumph, no "I told you so." There was only empathy for a man broken by the truth. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders. "Your stove shouts, Silas," she said, her voice soft but clear in the sudden quiet of the cabin. "It shouts at the cold, and the cold shouts back. My hearth, it tells a story, a long, quiet story. It learned from the river and the stone. It invites the warmth in instead of trying to fight the cold out." She gestured to the space inside her home, to the huddled, freezing families of his followers. "There is soup on the hearth," she said simply, "and the bread is almost ready. Come in, all of you. Come in and close the door." When the great freeze finally broke, it left a changed world in its wake. The valley was scarred, lives had been lost. But something new had been born in the crucible of the cold. The story of what happened in Ilara Vance's cabin spread faster than a spring thaw. It was a story told not with mockery, but with a deep and humbling awe. Silas Thorne, the master builder, the voice of conventional authority, became Ilara's first and most devoted student. Stripped of his arrogance, he came to her with the humility of a true apprentice. He brought his tools, his knowledge of construction, and laid them at the service of her quiet, revolutionary wisdom. Together, they spent that spring and summer not just rebuilding, but reimagining. They did not just repair the cabins of Prospect's Hope, they transformed them. At the heart of each home, they built a river hearth. Silas, with his builder's eye, found ways to improve the design, to make the tunnels easier and safer to dig, to integrate them more seamlessly into the existing structures. But he never forgot the core principle. He called it the Vance method. Alara simply called it listening. The community, once a chorus of mockery, became a team of collaborators. The shared trauma of the freeze had broken their old certainties and opened them to a new way of thinking. They worked together, digging the tunnels, hauling the river stones, sharing the labor and the knowledge. The settlement was no longer a collection of isolated families fighting their own private wars against the winter. It had become a single, interconnected system, warmed by a shared understanding. Alara Vance never sought recognition. She never once mentioned Silas's previous scorn. She simply shared what she knew, patiently and generously. The liability had become the foundation. The fool on the hill was now the unshakable center of their community. Her status was not one of power, but of a deep, quiet respect that was more profound than any authority. She was a living legend, not for any grand act of heroism, but for the simple, world-changing act of digging a hole based on a dead man's dream. Years later, long after Alara was gone and her children were grown, a newcomer to the valley was being shown the workings of a river hearth by Silas Thorne's grandson. He was a young engineer from the East, full of modern ideas about insulation and forced air heating. He was skeptical of this primitive-looking system. The grandson, a man with his grandfather's hands and Alara Vance's quiet eyes, simply smiled. He led the engineer to the town's small, handwritten archive and showed him a leather-bound journal. It was Liam Vance's journal. On the last page, beneath a faded sketch of a tunnel connecting a cabin to a river, was a final entry, written in a neat, feminine hand. The engineer read the words aloud. Liam used to say that a ship's hull knows the secrets of pressure. He was not wrong. Wood gives fire, but stone gives warmth. One is a shout, the other is a story. I chose the story.